Right, welcome aboard, and it's wonderful to have everybody here. It's wonderful to see so many people joining together, having the opportunity to learn Tanya. What we're going to do is this. I know that some of you are familiar with what Tanya is, and some of you are unfamiliar with what Tanya is. So this is the introductory series. I know some of you have been part of a Tanya share for a long time, and you're familiar with many of the concepts. That's fine. I've also learned Tanya before, and when you come back and you learn it again, each time you find a new set of insights and a new perspective and a greater depth to what you had before, and that's how we keep learning, and that's how we keep growing ourselves. So welcome aboard. This is the introductory series, which means over the next few weeks, we're going to introduce generally where Tanya comes from, a little bit of the history behind it, and then the introduction to the book itself. Hopefully, the goal is that will whet your appetite, and you'll be really keen to get involved in the full-blown learning of Tanya, which will follow this. But you can't really start something unless you understand what it is that you're dealing with, right? You know what they say? What's the difference between ignorance and apathy? Well, people tell you, I don't know, and I don't care. In other words, if you don't know something, you can't really care about it. And that's the bottom line. If you don't understand what this is, I'm sure that some of you are here out of pure curiosity. What is this book, Tanya? Why does everybody talk about it? What can it do? So I kind of teased a little bit on social media before this year with questions, some of which got more response than others. One of the questions was, if I would offer you a step-by-step manual to access your own soul, would you want to read it? And it was quite interesting to see the responses that we got from people, because some people were, yes, absolutely, yes, sign me up. Where do I find this kind of book? And some people were a little bit more skeptical and were saying things along the lines of, who says that such a book exists? And how do I know it's trustworthy? And who tells you that this information is actually accurate? And then there were other interesting questions and responses that came like, is Tanya more similar to Eastern philosophy, or is Tanya more similar to Western philosophy? And I thought that was quite an insightful question. So the goal and the purpose over here of this shir, of this time that we're going to spend together, first and foremost, is to try and deal with those things. Is it feasible to have a book, the user manual for your soul? And that means that, to help you understand the nature of your own inner structure, to help you understand what is it to have a soul. We throw around these words like nothing. Some people have spent more time investigating what a soul is. Perhaps some people have spent less time. So what is a soul? What is our purpose? Why are we here? Why do we sometimes feel such an emptiness in our lives? Why other times do we feel so inspired? How come it is that I could go from the one extreme to the other so quickly? Ever have that problem? One day I'm so enthused and so inspired. The next day I'm so flat. What's going on? What is the objective? What does Judaism expect of us? Does Judaism expect of us that we should be perfect? That's an important question which we'll talk about during the course of Tanya, because I think that some people do have this perfection complex, where they expect that, the Judaism has so many rules and so many things that we have to follow, so surely there's an expectation of getting a really good result. There are many, many questions, some of which bother us, some of which are curiosity for us, some of which we have never really thought about. And if nothing else, Tanya is going to take us on a journey of discovery of many of these topics. But I think we need a little bit of background first. So that's where we're going to start, with a bit of a history lesson. And I didn't make up this approach, by the way. You look in the Torah. How does the Torah work? First, it tells us stories. Story of creation, story of the forefathers, of the matriarchs, Joseph and his brothers, the journey into Egypt, the slavery in Egypt, the exodus from Egypt. After it's told us a whole lot of stories to create a backdrop and to help us understand where we come from, then the Torah says, and now why we are really here. You get the story of the giving of the Torah and the laws that follow. In fact, Chassidim have a tongue-in-cheek expression that we use, because there's a statement from the Talmud that says, Hamaiseh hu ha'ikar, which means that the main thing is what you translate into action. Very often people get caught up in deep philosophy, abstract concepts, very spiritual stuff, but hamaiseh hu ha'ikar. The most important thing is translating it into deed, into action. So Chassidim say, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, hamaiseh, you know what a maiseh is? A maiseh is a good story. Hamaisahu ha'ikar. Sometimes when you hear a good story, sometimes when you hear the historical context to something, that actually helps you not only to contextualize it, but also to appreciate what the take-home message is. Or as the expression goes, start with the end in mind. We sing this on a Friday night, right? The famous Lecha Doidi, right? What do we sing? Soif Maaseh b'machshava techila. That the ultimate goal and purpose is actually your first thought. Sometimes when you tell a story, sometimes when you hear the historical context, it helps to crystallize what we're actually trying to achieve over here. Where did this book come from? Who wrote it? What's the background to the individual and the movement that he belonged to? And why does that make this book so incredibly compelling? And so there's two stories that I'd like to share with you. One story is kind of not necessarily historical as much as it is conceptual, and the other one is historical. So here's the first story. Some of you have heard me tell the story before, so apologies for repeating it. The story goes like this. Once upon a time, approximately 300 years ago, there was a terribly devastating event that happened in heaven. I don't know if you heard about it, but at the time it was an incredibly important and devastating event. What happened? Well, you have to understand that after thousands of years of good service, Gehenna, which most people will translate as hell, but that's not really a great translation because Jews don't really believe in hell. Yeah, purgatory is probably a better word. So after thousands of years of service, Gehenna burnt down. And it was a crisis meeting in heaven. What do you do? Gehenna is gone. Where do we put all these people who deserve to go through some kind of a spiritual cleansing process? Why? What do you do with all these people who need some kind of retribution? So there was a crisis meeting, and of course all the great angels came forward. You can imagine heaven has great resources. So they had the engineering angels and the architectural angels and the design angels, and all the various angels came forward, and they came up with different suggestions of how to ensure that the new Gehenna, which they would have to build because you have to replace Gehenna, how could you ensure that Gehenna would never burn down again? And as they always say in the classics, they sat for 3 days and for 3 nights, and they debated and they argued back and forth. Perhaps we should try this technology. Perhaps we should try that design. Maybe if we use different material for the walls. Maybe if we make small compartments, there's not so much fire in one place. Maybe if we space it out, social distancing. Maybe if we come out with different forms of being able to burn people, not just classical fire. Maybe this way Gehenna will endure. And all the proposals were put forward. And at one point, they were about to settle on a certain proposal when there was a voice from the back of the room. And everybody turned around. And much to their surprise, instead of one of the great angels who had this incredible insight into how to design a perfect Gehenna, they turned around, and who's standing over there? The soul of a great tzaddik, the soul of a great Jewish sage. Standing at the back of the room, and he says, with all due respect, I have a different suggestion. Think about what you're about to propose. You all want to suggest that what we should do is take all of our resources, all of our time, all of our insight, all of our intelligence, all of our money, and pump it into Gehenna. What a waste of resources. Why don't we take all of our know-how, all of our insight, all of our wisdom, all of our resources, and why don't we instead plug that into making the most incredible Gan Eden, the most incredible paradise. A Gan Eden that is so spectacular, that is so overwhelming, that is so brilliant, that it makes the old Gan Eden feel like Gehenna. And everybody was completely taken aback. This is brilliant. All the angels could never have come up with such an incredible, out-of-the-box, lateral perspective. That's the value of souls. Souls see things differently. And so all the angels stepped back and they said, brilliant. We absolutely acknowledge that this is the best suggestion so far. And so it is that approximately 300 years ago, the old Gehenna was decommissioned, It was left in ruins, and instead they fashioned a magnificent Gan Eden that was so brilliant and so amazing and so beyond anybody's expectations that today, what used to be called Gan Eden is now called Gehenna, because now we truly appreciate what Gan Eden is. This legend is a legend that is told by Chassidim, and the individual who popped up at the back of the room over there was the soul of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Chassidic movement, which takes us into the history of this story. The history of the story is that if you want to understand what Tanya is, you have to have a little bit of an understanding as to what the Chassidic movement is and what Chassidic philosophy is, or as we call it in its original term, Chassidus. What is Chassidus? People often ask, is that like Kabbalah light? Is that what Chassidus is? You know, there's Kabbalah, which is like really heavy stuff and deeply mystical and completely esoteric, and people don't really understand it. And then you get the watered-down version, which is made for the layperson, which is really attractive, and it's served with a couple of l'chaims and some herring, and everybody likes it. That's Chassidus. No, not at all. If you want to understand what Chassidus is, which will lead us to understand what the book of Tanya is, this legend of the destruction of Gehenna and the new Gan Eden is our first point of access. The Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, who had an incredibly difficult childhood, by the way, he was orphaned from both of his parents at a very young age, and he was left pretty much to his own devices. He had the guiding inspiration of his father, who on his deathbed told him two things. Number one, fear nothing and nobody other than God himself. Number two, love every Jew with every fiber of your heart, with your whole being. And those became the guiding principles of his outlook in life. And of course, that translates into the Chassidic movement. So the Baal Shem Tov, as a young boy, was left very much to his own devices. The community tried to look after him. He had been taught by his father not to fear anything, so he used to wander around it. He'd end up in the forest. And he eventually found a group of mystics, and he joined their ranks and very quickly became deeply embedded in Jewish mystical teachings. And for a period of time, nobody knew who he was, nobody knew of his abilities, other than this tight-knit circle of people who pretty much kept to themselves. But sometime down the line, some 26 years later, the Baal Shem Tov began to teach. And he began to expose a radically different approach to what was prominent Judaism in Eastern Europe at that time. And this is where the history becomes really important. You know, think of this year. Think of how difficult it's been. Think of how isolated we've been. Think of how much pressure there has been on society, on communities, on families, on individuals because of the virus. Everybody will tell you they cannot wait for this year to end because it's been so debilitating, because it's split us apart, because it's put so much pressure on us. The truth be told, yes, of course, it's been an incredibly difficult year. But if we think for a second that this is the most difficult of Jewish history, and if we think for a second that our forebears didn't go through more difficult times in history, well, we're probably out of touch with history. That period of Jewish history, we're talking now in the 17th century, in Eastern Europe, countries like Poland. Poland at that time was like a mega center of Jewish people. And boy, did they have it rough. They really, really had a difficult time. They had a difficult time on multiple levels. On the one hand, there was rampant anti-Semitism. It eventually came to a head in 1648 at the time of Chmielnicki's uprising, where effectively the Polish peasants rose up against the nobility and did what they always do, blamed and attacked the Jews. And the Jewish communities were ravaged. It was terrible. Physically, people were killed. Their properties were taken. People were assaulted. It destroyed entire communities. And it's not like their life was great before that. You can well imagine that many Jewish people living at that time in that part of the world suffered terribly financially. There were limitations on what kind of industries they could get involved in, what kind of jobs they could hold. That's one of the reasons that the Polish peasants didn't like them, because Jews were allowed to be money collectors, because the Christians wouldn't do it. It was a very rough time. And then add to that the internal strife of the Jewish community. Unfortunately, it's an unfortunate reality, and it very often is the case. You know, we have enough tourists from the outside, but for some reason it doesn't stop us from having our own internal issues. And at that particular point in time, there were so many Jewish people who just simply could not afford the luxury of Jewish education. Not because of the cost of education as we have today, where everybody complains about the cost of private schooling. The problem that they had in those days is that education was just inaccessible because people had to be out there and they had to be earning. Very often you had these child-headed households. You had people who were under tremendous pressure from circumstances outside of their control. They simply did not have the luxury of going about and getting an education. Now, we know how the Jews are, right? We know because it's our community. And we know how much we pride ourselves in our education. And we know how divisive it could become if you have a society that really celebrates academics and really celebrates intellectual value. And then you have people who just don't have that. So they don't have the know-how. They're pretty much illiterate. They can't follow a shul service. Do you know what it's like to walk into a shul and you can't follow the service? I'm pretty sure that some of you can relate exactly to that. Now imagine you walk into a shul and you can't follow the shul service, and instead of the person next to you leaning over and kindly saying, here, we're on this and this page, imagine the person looks down their nose at you and says, what's wrong with you? Or worse, says that you're less Jewish because you're less familiar. Now, unfortunately, that was a reality in much of Eastern Europe at that point in time. There were divisions within the community between the intellectual haves and the intellectual have-nots. It was along the lines of you davened in the shul that was related to your spiritual class. So if you were an academic and you did know how to navigate your way through the Talmud, well, then you could go to one of the prestigious shuls in the community. But if, on the other hand, you were just an artisan, perhaps a shoemaker, a water carrier, a wagon driver, which were quite common occupations in those days, and you couldn't follow the service, or you didn't know your way through the Gemara, or whatever the case is, then you were relegated to one of those communities where effectively the people were looked down upon, and they would sit, and they were very sincere people. And they were religious people. There's the irony of the story. It's not that they were secular. They were committed to their Judaism. They just simply did not have that depth of knowledge. And yet they felt discriminated against. Very often these are people who would wake up early in the morning. And they would read the entire book of Tehillim, of Psalms, to show their dedication to God. Because that's all they could do. Some of them knew the whole of Tehillim by heart. And during the course of the day, as they were milking their cows and fixing their wagons, they would be consistently repeating words of Tehillim. And yet, an elite segment of the community, which was effectively the leadership and the intelligentsia of the community, totally disregarded them. Can you imagine living in that society where the Cossacks on the outside are out to kill you? When you're battling to put food on the table because of the economic reality that you live in, and your own community believes that you're a second-class citizen just simply because, in spite of all your best intentions, you just don't have the academic insight that they do. Something had to change. Something had to change in that environment, because you can well imagine we were going to lose Jews, left, right, and center. And if we were not going to lose them to being killed, we were certainly going to lose them to being engaged. Now, if you go back further in history, this wasn't the nature of Jewish communities over the longest period of time. But at this point in time, it's what had happened. And at this point in time, it was eroding the nature and the fiber of our own communities. And it got one bit more difficult than that. Because at that particular point in time, there were also individuals who took it on themselves to go around and to berate these hapless Jews who simply didn't know how to learn, and give them the impression that they were doomed. They would get up, it was actually a good business in those days. People sometimes go around, you get these traveling speakers, they come around to town, they get up, they speak, everybody applauds, wonderful, you laugh at their jokes, it's like really impressive. People stream, well, I suppose in the pre-COVID days, people would actually physically go and listen to people speaking. Well, in those days, they had the same kind of thing. They were called the itinerant preachers. They didn't get up and give these great speeches with a good joke at the beginning and a moving story at the end. They got up over there and they read the riot act to those communities. So can you imagine? These people already felt so self-conscious about their lack of knowledge, about their lack of ability. And then they'd have these individuals arrive who looked so religious and so representative of Judaism, and they would just give them, as they say in the classics, Iberen Kop, that they'd just berate them absolutely from a dizzy height and say, you people are no good, and terrible things are going to happen to you because of your lack of commitment. And the Baal Shem Tov arrives on the scene and totally flipped that model. Because the Baal Shem Tov's core teaching was that every single one of us, regardless of the level of our knowledge, regardless of our circumstances, regardless of what we may or may not be doing in our Judaism, every single one of us is precious in God's eyes. And you want to know how precious? The Baal Shem Tov was fond of saying, can you imagine a couple who had been childless for most of their life, and then suddenly, out of the blue, when they're already at an advanced age, suddenly they have a child, completely unexpected. The doctors all scratching their heads. Can you imagine how much that couple will love that child? The Baal Shem Tov was fond of saying that Hashem loves every single one of us with a deeper love than those parents would have for that child. And so, very quietly at first, community to community, the Baal Shem Tov traveled extensively, and then later, more loudly and more publicly, the Baal Shem Tov began to teach a different story. A story of your intrinsic value, by virtue of your soul, that cannot be made more valuable when you learn more, or less valuable when you're less knowledgeable. It was a story that said your soul is pure. Your soul is a piece of God. And actually, every expression of commitment that you show, even if on the broad scale of Judaism, your little commitment doesn't seem like much, even if there are people out there who are so-called professional Jews who might look at you with disdain and say, that's the best you could come up with, every bit of effort that you put in, the Baal Shem Tov taught, is an expression of the truth of your soul. It's an expression of real connection between the essence of your being and the essence of your maker. You can well imagine that if you belonged to one of those second-class communities and a person came and started to teach this and started to send out representatives and students to communities to keep reiterating that message. Your Tehillim every single morning is the single most precious thing in God's world, even if you don't understand one word of that Tehillim. Every single time that you do a mitzvah, even though you don't appreciate exactly how to do the mitzvah, and maybe you do it completely wrong, is absolutely beautiful in Hashem's eyes. You can imagine it was a resurrection of a dying majority of the Jewish world. In fact, Chassidim say that at that time, a big portion of the Jewish world was semi to unconscious spiritually. And it's no accident that Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov's first name was Yisrael, because that's the collective name of the Jewish people. And when somebody's fainted and you want to wake them up, what do? You call them by name. So the Baal Shem Tov came carrying the name Yisrael to indicate that that's what he was going to do. Nu, Yisrael, Yisrael, wake up. Wake up to a different reality. Wake up to a different perspective of who you are. Stop hammering each other. Stop telling yourself or telling the next person how distant they are. Wake up to a real truth, which is that you may feel distant, but you can never be distant. It's one of the themes we'll learn in the second chapter of Tanya, where he unpacks this in a brilliant way with an analogy which I believe we only really get to understand with modern science. Even at the time that the book of Tanya was written, it wasn't as clear and as overt as we can afford to understand now. And the Baal Shem Tov also went around and said, this Gan Eden that everybody aspires towards, you know, all the so-called professional upper crust Jews who knew how to learn and who understood the value of doing a particular mitzvah in a particular way and who invested time and energy to make sure that they could do everything in the frummer than thou kind of mode. So what are you chasing? What is your goal? You're investing in this world because you want to get a Gan Eden in the next world, right? That's what you're doing. A little bit of price you pay here in order to get front row seats there, in order to get a villa that overlooks the spiritual ocean. That Gan Eden that you have been chasing is actually Gehenna when you get to really appreciate what Gan Eden is. When you get to really appreciate the value of the moment you do a mitzvah. When you get to really appreciate the experience of your own soul, then all of these sort of fabricated versions of a next world that you've been chasing, they melt away because they're no longer valuable. Don't live your life for some future. Live your life for the value of now. And so those became core principles of the Chassidic movement. Needless to say, you can well imagine, Jews don't accept change within the religion too easily. We've seen what happens with that. We kind of spawn other religions, and then they turn around, they're not necessarily so friendly towards us. So we're quite nervous of people who come with a new take on what Judaism is. Actually, if you put it into immediate context, not long before the Baal Shem Tov was the horrible debacle of a man called Chabad Chassidic, a charlatan, who claimed to dabble in the mystical, who made sweeping promises that the age of Mashiach had arrived, who then later claimed that he himself was the Messiah, who gathered Jews from all over Poland and surrounding regions and got them to sell up everything and follow him. Can you imagine in those days, before there was international travel as we know it, can you imagine packing up everything and then schlepping halfway across the world, really, to get to Israel because the Mashiach is coming? And people bought it. And they were so desperate for help and for guidance that they believed it. And then at the last moment, Chabad Chassidic turned around and became a Muslim. And people's faith came crashing down. Do you know how guarded the Jewish community was at that point in time for anybody else who's going to arrive and be a charismatic, mystical leader? Can you imagine how they looked at the Baal Shem Tov with suspicion? Whoa, what's going to happen over here? We saw what happened last time. It was devastating. It was destructive. Who knows if this is going to be any different? So you can imagine there was pushback. And there was a group that emerged that opposed this new practice that was associated with who in those days they used to call der Freiliche, what you and I would call the happy clappers. Freilich means to be joyous. And one of the things that has always represented Chassidim is that Chassidim are a joyous bunch. A lot of singing, a lot of optimism, a lot of talk about how things will be good and God loves you and you should love your fellow Jew. None of this austere version of stay in the books and learn and accumulate an understanding of the rigors of Jewish practice. So there was a lot of concern that the Chassidic movement was going to derail Judaism. Of course, we know that that's not what happened. In fact, on the contrary, we know that at that point in time, Hasidism saved Judaism in that part of the world, for sure. And then later it would spread further. But at least at that point in time, it was in that part of the world. The Baal Shem Tov was tremendously successful. And although people often paint the picture of the Baal Shem Tov being a Pied Piper who had a whole lot of ignorant Jews following him, the truth is that the inner circle of the Baal Shem Tov school were some of the greatest scholars at the time. Somebody asked a question over here. What is new about the Baal Shem Tov's teaching to love every Jew when it says clearly in the Torah that you should love your fellow Jew as yourself? It's a brilliant question, and I'll extend the question a step further. The truth is you could ask that question about every single thing about not only the Baal Shem Tov, but the broader Hasidic movement. What does it really teach us that we don't already know? And that's exactly how you know that something is authentic Judaism. It doesn't teach you anything that you don't already know. That's the point. This is rooted in real Judaism. This has to track back to original sources. It's just where you put, as we say in Yiddish, the knetch, where you put the emphasis, where you put what do you prioritize? So there are those who prioritize the religiosity of Judaism, and the Baal Shem Tov came back and said, hang on a second, there's a famous teaching from Rabbi Akiva that the entire Torah is founded on the principle to love your fellow Jew. What happened to that? How is it possible? Where in the Torah does it say your academic knowledge of the books that you're studying overrides the way you treat the next person? So the Baal Shem Tov wanted to create a correction where we had perhaps lost sight of core values of Judaism. Of course, it's more than that, and we'll discuss how it's more than that, because there's got to be a radical innovation of Hasidus. And we'll get to that point. I don't know if that will be this evening or not, but we'll get to that point. So continuing the story, and in the course of the story, those details hopefully will fall into place. The Baal Shem Tov was incredibly successful. His inner circle included some of the leading scholars of the region at the time. People don't often give credit to what level of scholarship the Baal Shem Tov attracted. The Baal Shem Tov is known for restoring that goodwill amongst Jews, for restoring faith in themselves. He's less known for his incredible Torah knowledge, to the point that some of the great sages of the time who were opponents of the Baal Shem Tov, when they eventually got to meet him, were completely won over, not by his miracle making, but by his scholarly knowledge. The Baal Shem Tov was then succeeded by Rabbi Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich, who, by the way, is Exhibit A of exactly that point. Rabbi Dov Ber was a prominent rabbi. He was a leading sage at the time in the town of Mezrich, which was a Torah center. And the Maggid of Mezrich, as he later became known, was a very outspoken opponent of the Baal Shem Tov. He didn't believe any of the stuff. He felt it was misguided. And he really had issues with this fledgling Hasidic movement. By the way, just to add to that, he was in fact older than the Baal Shem Tov. Typically you expect that somebody's student will be their junior, but in his case, he was actually the Baal Shem Tov's senior. And then he was open-minded enough, and you have to consider that that's how Torah is supposed to be done, supposed to be followed. He was open-minded enough to go and explore for himself and to engage the Baal Shem Tov for himself. And when he arrived at the Baal Shem Tov's shul, he stood outside and listened through the window at first, just to hear what was the nature of the teachings. Was it aligned with Judaism or not? And as he stood out there, the Maggid of Mezrich had certain health challenges. As he stood outside, the Baal Shem Tov, who obviously could not see him from where he was sitting, he was standing behind the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov suddenly changed track in the middle of the delivery of the particular Torah discourse and began to speak about an individual who suffered from certain health ailments and certain spiritual reasons why he would have had those health ailments and how he should address them in a spiritual way. Of course, the Maggid was completely taken by that, and they engaged, and he became a dedicated student and subsequently the successor to the Baal Shem Tov. So while the Baal Shem Tov was very much the charismatic, outgoing leader who traveled around and engaged with people and built communities from the bottom up, the Maggid of Mezrich looked to consolidate the core of the HQ of the Hasidic movement. He had a different style of teaching. He was an incredibly methodical person, so he created very strong and powerful structures around the Hasidic movement, which was quite important because there was all the pushback from the rest of the community, the rest of the religious community. So it was important to create those structures. And then he appointed his best students. Now you have to know that the Maggid of Mezrich had incredibly astute students. So he appointed various of his students to head up the Hasidic movement in different regions around the area. And out of those different leaders became what you and I today know as different Hasidic groups. So for example, you go to Jerusalem, you see some people walk around with big fur hats, and some people have white socks, and some people have gold coats. And although those are all external factors, but they do represent the fact that there are different Hasidic groups. Those different Hasidic groups emerged at this point in time. We're talking now, call it 270, 80 years ago. So we're talking about a period in time where there were these individuals who took one particular focus of the Baal Shem Tovs and they basically built on it. And they developed a unique niche of Hasidus based on those particular teachings. Now, the purpose of this evening is not to go through every single one of them. And very nice comment over here that someone's made. The type of fundamentalist the Baal Shem Tov was to go back to the fundamentals of Torah in a real way. We are going to talk about that, please God. So I'm not going to go through all the different groups and identify all of who they are, except for two of them, the one that's most relevant to us and a person who was very close to him. So one of the great leaders was called Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Horodok, who almost, in a sense, was a Rebbe in his own right, even to some of his peers. He was an incredible human being. And he eventually went to Israel and set up the origins of the Hasidic movement in Israel. He had a colleague, and it's his colleague that we're really interested in for the purposes of our discussion. His colleague's name was Rabbi Shneur Zalman, originally of Liadi and later the Rabbi of Liozna, or as we call him in the Chabad world, the Alter Rebbe, the senior Rebbe of the Hasidic movement. He was the one who wrote the Tanya, the book that we're going to study together, and he was the one who founded the unique brand of Hasidim called Chabad. So if you want to understand what Tanya is, you've got to know about the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe was going to join Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Horodok on his journey to Israel, but then eventually he pulled back, and the Maggid of Mezrich wanted him instead to tackle the stronghold of opposition to the Hasidic movement, which was Lithuania. And for that reason, some of his colleagues actually would refer to him, because of his origins, because of where he landed up, they'd actually refer to him as the Lithuanian, which is quite ironic for a South African Jewish community, because, we're a Litvischer community, we're a Lithuanian community, so it's quite something for us to understand that the Chabad movement is actually, ironically, a Litvischer movement. So that's quite an interesting anomaly in its own right. Rabbi Shneur Zalman at an incredibly young age was renowned as a scholar in his own environment. In fact, he gave a shiur before his bar mitzvah on the very complicated laws of Kiddush Levana, how you work out, Kiddush HaChodesh, how you work out the nature of the calendar and the astronomical calculations. And present at his shiur, this is a boy before his bar mitzvah, present at his shiur were all leading scholars, and some of them simply couldn't follow it. It was too advanced for them. He was known as an incredible scholar from a very young age. In those days, people got married in their teens. And the typical approach to marriage was that a couple would get married, and then the young man would go off and he would study for a couple of years in a yeshiva of his choice, and he'd be supported by his father-in-law. When the Alter Rebbe got married, he had to make a choice. He had two options of which yeshiva to go and study in. On the one hand, there was the great yeshiva in Vilna under the leadership of the very famous Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna. That was the one option. And the other option was to go to Mezrich under the guidance of Rabbi Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich. And the Alter Rebbe was unsure which yeshiva he should choose. I mean, he had the options open to him. And eventually came to this conclusion, and it's a very insightful conclusion to understand something about the nature of Hasidus that makes it unique. He came to the conclusion that if we would go to Vilna, Vilna was a center of Torah learning where you would learn how to learn. And the Alter Rebbe had, at that stage, already done quite well in learning how to learn. But if you would go to the Maggid of Mezrich, that was a center that would teach you how to pray. And the Alter Rebbe felt that he was absolutely unaware of how a Jew should pray. And so he opted to go to Mezrich. His father-in-law was furious. His father-in-law disowned him. His father-in-law would have nothing to do with him. He tried to convince his wife to divorce him. You cannot believe the levels of animosity that existed in the community at the time. And it took years for the family to come around and to understand and to appreciate that the Alter Rebbe had in fact remained not only committed to Judaism, because there was the fear that he was joining what they in those days called the cult, but there was a concern that he'd come back and he'd be one of these happy clappers. Here you've got this individual who was this deep scholar, and the next thing you know, he'd be bouncing up and down and drinking l'chaims and having herring. There was a tremendous concern. So it took a long time until everybody came around and appreciated that in fact he hadn't lost his mind or his way. And he then became one of the core representatives of the Hasidic movement. He was not popular in the religious world, especially after he published the Book of Tanya. The Book of Tanya was seen as a revolutionary work. It's interesting to note that the Maggid of Mezrich had commissioned the Alter Rebbe to revise the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, and to publish an updated version, not updated, God forbid, to change any of the laws, but to include a lot more of the conversation that had happened in the couple of hundred years since the original Code of Jewish Law was published. And the Alter Rebbe did this, and it took him a relatively short period of time, and that set of books is considered a scholarly work that everybody respects across the full spectrum of Jewish teaching till today. It took him not very long, a number of years to put it together. The Book of Tanya, on the other hand, took him 20 years to write. And in those 20 years, he would agonize at times over the use of a single word or even a single letter. It would be fair to say that the Book of Tanya is the book that the Alter Rebbe invested his soul into. It is the book that is the core teaching of all Chabad Chassidic philosophy. We, in Chassidic circles, call it the Bible of Chassidus. Meaning to say, just as when you look in the Torah, in the Bible, it's letter perfect and you can derive heaps of information from a single word, well, the Tanya is similar. There's so much teaching that has been built on this little book called the Tanya. And it created absolute waves in the community at the time. Terrible pushback. There were scholarly debates. They called the Alter Rebbe to defend certain of the things that he had taught in Tanya. And the amazing thing is, at the end of every one of those debates, new people would join the Alter Rebbe's ranks because they were so impressed, not just by his charisma, but by the way he was able to explain how these radical processes and thoughts were actually founded in core values of Judaism and actually are what Torah teaches. And so, in spite of their best efforts, this Hasidic branch called Chabad began to grow and grow specifically in the areas of the greatest opposition to the Hasidic movement. And so, just less than 2 years after the Tanya was published, there was a group of individuals who felt that there's no other way to stop this spread of the so-called cult in its tracks other than to get the government involved to remove the Alter Rebbe from the picture. And so there were individuals who went to, can you believe this? They went to the Russian government, the Tsarist government that was not particularly friendly to the Jewish nation, and they created a libel against the Alter Rebbe, which was founded on a few different principles. One was that he was working with enemies of the Russia, the Ottoman Empire, because at the time he was sending a lot of money to Israel, setting up communities in Israel, and Israel was under the Ottoman rule, so it was considered potentially treason against the Russian government. They said that in the book of Tanya, he used disparaging remarks against the Tsar. Now, you can only well imagine what happened if you spoke out against the Tsar in those days. And so the Alter Rebbe was arrested and he was placed in prison for 52 days. And it's an important part of the story which actually deserves more attention than what we're going to do this evening. But what's incredibly important is that when he was released from prison, which nobody could have predicted, because not only did he get out of prison, and not only did he not serve a full sentence, but it was a miraculous turn of events where effectively he was endorsed by the Russian government. And although they hauled him back into prison again a few years later, it was kind of just a relatively short interrogation. But this was a pivotal moment in the development of the Chabad world. So much so that he was imprisoned in St. Petersburg, and Hasidim until today speak about the Chabad movement prior to Petersburg and post-Petersburg, because it really took off as a philosophy, as a movement, as a teaching practice, as a meditative approach within Judaism after that prison experience in an unprecedented fashion. So while the book of Tanya had been produced before that, the book of Tanya really took off after that prison experience. And so, of course, what's most intriguing for us is, so what is the book? That's why we're here, right? We're here to study the book of Tanya. And who better to introduce the book to us than the author himself? So what we're going to do, please God, over the next few weeks is we're going to read his introduction, where he explains how he got to write the book, what the intention of the book is, why it is different to any other book that exists. And then what we'll do is we'll have a look at what's called the Sharblatt, which is effectively the cover page, because every traditional Jewish book has a unique cover page. And on that cover page, you kind of put your mission statement of what this book is all about. So we'll analyze that mission statement. And from that, we'll understand what the nature of the book is. And then, please God, we'll begin to study it. But tonight, we'll just do one word of introduction. Now that we've done some of the history, not all of the history, we'll do one word of introduction. And that is the name of the book, as we call it. The Alter Rebbe referred to his book as Likutei Amorim, which just really means, it's quite a humble way of presenting a book, a collection of sayings, as if to say, I'm not innovating, none of this is mine, it's all collected from other sources. That was his great humility. But over the course of time, the book has come to be known as Tanya, and Tanya is because of the first word that is used in the book. The first word of the book is Tanya, which is a Talmudic expression. And it's an expression that means we have learnt. And if you have a look, he quotes from a particular source, which is the Talmud in Tractate Nida. And you go look at the page, because he tells you exactly where it is at the end of the 3rd chapter, and you go page through the book. And guess what you will find? You will find the quotation that the Alter Rebbe uses, but it does not have the word Tanya, which is a very common word in Talmudic language. It doesn't have the word. So for some odd reason, the Alter Rebbe began his book with what appears to be a misquotation. Now, of course, if you're a bibliophile and you look a little bit further, you'll find that, as is common with the Talmud, there are often multiple variants of what a text is supposed to say. And look hard enough, you will find that there is an obscure version that actually has the word Tanya. But most versions of the Gemara have the words Dorash Rabbi Simloi. Rabbi Simloi taught. So why would the Alter Rebbe, who was under so much flack, being attacked from the entire religious world, why would he choose to take his magnum opus and start it with an expression that is controversial, that many people would say indicates that perhaps he wasn't familiar with the texts, must be that in that word Tanya itself, in the very word, there is the insight and the secret as to what this book is all about. So what is the book all about? What does Tanya mean? That's what we're going to do, please God, next week.